Neoliberalism. At its core, this entire book is an attempt to normalize Reaganomics as natural and meritocratic. Individual merit has almost nothing to do with the distribution of wealth in a class society, and ours is no exception. We've seen that the ideological framework used in The Bell Curve is absurd, so we need a new theoretical basis for understanding our political economic system. To understand Reaganomics, Thatcherism, or neoliberalism, whatever you prefer to call capitalism with 21st century characteristics, it's necessary to understand commodities, wealth, capital, profit, and classes in their historical and geographical context. That's the only way to grasp why the union busting and outsourcing began, and why previous compromises like the New Deal can't simply be dusted off. A commodity is anything that is produced through labor power for the purpose of exchanging it, as on the aforementioned markets. This means that labor power, your ability to create and transform, in a capitalist system is, itself, a commodity. When commodity production becomes generalized, a universal equivalent emerges. This is money. In a moneyed system, everything becomes a commodity, even things like innocence, truth, loyalty, etc. You can buy legal defense, PR firms, and mercenaries, after all. The typical wisdom with regards to commodities is that they are priced on the basis of their scarcity. But commodities aren't immediately scarce. They are artificial. There is a set limit of, say, untouched wilderness. There is no set limit of tables. We can make more tables. We can make more of the machines necessary to produce tables. We can travel to Pluto and turn Pluto into a mass of tables using the functionally limitless energy supplied by our sun. What is actually scarce from our human perspective is time. Labor time is the commodity with the unique property that its use is to produce more value than went into making it. This is the labor theory of value. But my time is a priori just as scarce as yours. So what's really going on here? Why are there billionaires and also people dying in poverty? Obviously, if something is exchangeable, it must be useful. At least to someone. Accumulated useful things are wealth. All real wealth is nature, transformed by labor power. Some wealth, however, has the peculiar property that it is used in the production of more wealth. These are means of production: land, tractors, factories, laboratories, etc. Means of production are not immediately capital. The tractors on the collective farms of the USSR were not capital, and the elected officials administering their usage were not capitalists. The wheelbarrows used by serfs in feudal England were not capital, and the lords were not capitalists. In fact, things like land, tractors, and factories are not even immediately means of production. They only become this when workers use them to produce things. Being a means of production is a social quality, and it does not inhere in the thing itself. The same is true for capital. A specific social relation must be mediated through a means of production for it to be capital. Human beings obviously need to engage in productive labor in order to sustain themselves. At a bare minimum, this requires land to hunt and forage on. To live a more modern lifestyle, of course, this requires machinery. If a person does not own any of these things, they are at the mercy of those who do. They either need to cut some kind of deal with the owners or overthrow them. The owners only allow such access if they're going to get something out of it. This is the nature of capitalism. Workers make things, owners take them, sell them on the market, and give a fraction of the proceeds to the workers. People forced to take this deal are proletarians. The excess labor time extracted is profit. The extractors are capitalists. It is this class relationship that makes a means of production capital, the surplus a profit, a worker a proletarian, and an owner a capitalist. Either you own things and leverage that to extract excess labor time, or you are the laborer and are so exploited. The shares of this output are decided socially by class struggle, unions versus corporations, democracy versus money, capital versus labor. The capitalist share is called profit, the labor share is called a wage. In the US, more than half of all household income is claimed on the basis of ownership, and around 60% of all wealth is inherited. Roughly translated, that means that for every 2 lattes you make, you essentially get paid for making one of them, and that extra latte probably went to some trust fund baby. But it wasn't always like this. In the heyday of the so-called capitalist golden age in the 50s and 60s, the capitalist share was under 40%. So how did capitalists go from claiming around 38% of household income to more than half? To understand how America's brief foray into so-called social democracy was dismantled, there are 2 important things to grasp, and they have nothing to do with IQ. 1. Stagflation, a period beginning in the late 60s and lasting into the late 70s, in which there was a protracted period of low growth and high inflation simultaneously. 2. Capitalists don't want 38% or 50% of everything. They want everything. Stagflation was the opening they used to get what they wanted. Stagflation. Stagflation is low growth and high inflation at the same time. It is typified by high unemployment. There is a tendency to leave the explanation here, but that would itself be fetishistic. Inflation, GDP, and unemployment numbers are representations of the economy. They are not the economy itself. If we simply cleave to the numbers without trying to understand the ideological choices that go into determining the measurement, or what the measurements mean, we fetishize the representation. So what's really happening here? When capitalism collapsed globally in the late 1920s and failed to recover through the 1930s, capitalists throughout the liberal empires of the world feared a Russian-style communist revolution, and the mass unionization and organization amongst workers seemed to pose just such a threat. This is largely how the golden age of capitalism began. The coalition of the powerful was expanded to encompass some workers within the imperial center. That is, British workers were brought into it, not colonial subjects in India. Men were brought in far more than women. American white people were brought in over black people, and so on. This was done through Keynesian economics, or what some call demand-side economics. The general idea was to keep taxes very high on capitalists to incentivize realizing profits as more capital, instead of yachts or offshore bank accounts. Remember that profits are taxed, not revenue. If you reinvest them, they're still revenue. Meanwhile, these high taxes would be spent on big projects that capitalists either couldn't or wouldn't fund, either because the projects were too big, like our highway system, or too risky, like R&D. These projects would help to make the labor process in the US more efficient, thus allowing the rate of profit to stay high. Thoughtful, tight regulation on banks would ensure that finance served the economy and not the other way around. Finally, strong labor laws, high levels of unionization, and a robust public sector would ensure that a sturdy consumer base existed to provide a reliable market for capitalists to realize the output as profit. Richard Nixon famously said, "We're all Keynesians now." So how did that stop being a thing? Keynes' theory of inflation basically said that unemployment and inflation were inverses of each other. As inflation went up, unemployment should drop. As unemployment rose, inflation should drop. This was largely the mainstream view among capitalist economists, until stagflation, when both high inflation and unemployment presented simultaneously. Growth and employment got worse and worse, and attempts to pump up the economy through public spending only made inflation worse. The right always wanted to dismantle these social democratic policies, but this contradiction in Keynesian theory paralyzed their opposition. Neoliberal and neoclassical economists have a borderline metaphysical analysis of stagflation, largely assuming the low unemployment causes inflation. Quote, "Inflation is also related closely to unemployment. The Phillips curve relates the inverse relationship between the two. The theory states that with economic growth comes inflation, which in turn should lead to more jobs and less unemployment. However, the original concept has been challenged empirically due to the occurrence of stagflation in the 1970s. Economists have responded by allowing for many different Phillips curves to exist, or by amending the relationship between inflation and unemployment to changes in the rates of inflation and unemployment." End quote. If you were following economic news circa 2008 and the bailouts, then you'll recall right-wing fears about the bailouts causing mass inflation, even hyperinflation. Central banks around the world are largely stumped as to how they dumped so much cash, especially in the form of so-called quantitative easing, into the economy without seeing any inflation. That money largely went to the super wealthy who then used it almost exclusively to pump up the price of financial instruments, but that's not quite on topic. Here's what actually happened, and why Keynesianism worked while it did. High levels of public spending and robust labor standards create high levels of demand, which strains the capacity of the economy. When this happens, capitalists have to invest in expanding their capital stock, or they risk losing market share. This means they have to hire more workers, whether to build more means of production or else to produce things directly while those new means of production are built. As unemployment drops, workers' bargaining position improves. It's hard to discipline a worker who can just quit and get another job easily. As more capital is built, a larger proportion of the wealth of capitalists is tied up in fixed capital, which ceases to have value if no one is working it. This also causes the bargaining position of workers to improve. If the labor share of output rises, or if the productivity of new capital isn't high enough, both were true, profitability will fall. In a capitalist economy, real growth is always less than or equal to real profit. When profit falls faster than growth, the economy tightens. Any attempt to pump up the economy at this point will lead to inflation, as capitalists, desperate to maintain their market share, are driven to keep producing even as net profitability drops. They couldn't bargain wages down due to unions, so they inflated the selling price of commodities. At this point, we were still loosely on the gold standard. So inflation led to an even worse money market squeeze, effectively making things impossible to finance, especially as wealth piled up in the hands of workers who kept it in banks that couldn't engage in traditional investing. The low growth led to increasingly bad unemployment. Hence, stagflation. What we're seeing here is really class struggle. As workers gain more and more power, the system of capitalism begins to break down. Remember that means of production are only capital if the class relation is maintained. If workers have too much control over the investment process, the labor process, or the surplus, these means of production cease to be capital at all. As working class power grows, opportunities to expand and accumulate capital a priori diminish. This is the stagnation, an attempt to recuperate profitability, that is, capitalist class power, at the point of sale where there are no unions, is the inflation. Thus, inflation is actually linked with the investment share of profits, or the Barron ratio. When the economy tightens, capitalists will charge higher prices to try to maintain profitability. New purchasing power and net profitability are shift factors. This is Anwar Shaikh's classical curve, quoting at length from Johnson. Quote, comparing the mainstream neoclassical theory of the natural rate of unemployment, it is similar to Shaikh's theory in that they both incorporate a theory of a limit to supply and a measure of slack in the economy. However, the mainstream theory of supply assumes that the unemployment rate at which inflation is stable is effectively full employment, with no involuntary unemployment. Neoclassical theory tends to blame state intervention for inflation, an idea that calls for independent central banks and attacks on collective bargaining, wages, and working conditions. Post-Keynesians look at institutional and cost push factors in the labor market to explain inflation. This would require incomes policies which attempt to reduce it by reducing wage growth collectively. Shaikh's theory does not assume full employment, but instead suggests that there is a normal rate of involuntary unemployment which is systemic and tends to be restored despite fluctuations around it in both directions, driven by both free competition and policy intervention. End quote. The neoclassical view is essentially just propaganda masquerading as academia. These right-wing economic ideas are still right to a certain extent. When stagflation occurs, there are three basic ways out of it: higher unemployment, lower wages, or compensation for workers in the form of shares of capital. No worker would accept the first two. No capitalist would accept the latter. For decades, social democrats attempted to square the circle with fictitious capital, compensating workers with things like home equity, healthcare benefits, and pensions. But this could only go so far. Those financial instruments had to be realized as real goods and services eventually. In the end, for capitalism to maintain itself, for profitability to be maintained, democracy had to be crushed. Class struggle. I mentioned above that capitalists want 100% of all output. This isn't because they are inherently evil people, and it would hardly matter if they were saints. Capitalists are in competition with one another, meaning they have to drive down costs. That is, they have to reduce the amount of labor time they are using up per unit output. It's in their best interests to pay their workers nothing. But if every capitalist pays their workers barely enough to keep them alive, there can be no market for consumer goods like toasters, cars, washing machines, personal computers, nice clothes, etc. Also, there would likely be riots. Remember, if a thing has no use value, it isn't a value at all. With no markets, there is no value, and thus, no profits. On the flip side, workers don't want their bosses extracting any profit from them, but since capitalists won't countenance workers buying in and owning capital, higher wages would mean lower economic growth. It's the same issue. These groups of people have contradictory interests, and this is irreconcilable. But this isn't the only issue. Remember, all profits are privatized. If capitalists don't orient the realization of those profits towards new means of production, the surplus produced by society is just straight up wasted. The ratio of surplus to investment is known as the Barron ratio. So, what is neoliberalism then? It's mostly a return to the norm. Quote, to contextualize these numbers, from 1870 to 2008, the average annual world GDP growth rate was about 2.8%. This is approximately in line with the growth rate of countries with low Barron ratios. In other words, a non-productive capitalist class is a long-standing feature of capitalism. During the post-war golden age, 1950 to 75, the world GDP grew about 4.7% per year. This is close to the growth rate of economies with high Barron ratios, above 60%. Neoliberalism is a project to reduce wages. This video by Cockshot talks about the various historical laws of wages, but the overall message is this. Wages go down as the number of workers goes up. Wages go up as the amount of value in fixed capital increases. The neoliberal project instrumentalizes late 20th century technology, global information systems, supercomputers, container ships, to reduce the amount of fixed capital in a developed country, deindustrialization, free trade, while attempting to keep its population growth high. Open borders, amnesty, hostility to reproductive justice, etc. These are things that can only be achieved through hollowing out any authentically democratic institution. Voter purges, mass incarceration, union busting, propaganda, systematized bribery, dark money, tax havens, coups, regime change wars, neocolonialism, etc., and the increased militarization of society to deepen and maintain various forms of apartheid. It's really too much to go into here, so two things left to note. One, fascism is the importing of colonial methods of terror and exploitation to the metropole. Neoliberalism is the export of capital assets to the colonies. It's impossible to miss the links between these ideologies, from the reliance on endless war and systemic apartheid to the historic alliances between liberals and fascists. See Christopher Simpson's book, Blowback, or check out this interview. Fascism grows out of the militarization needed to maintain capitalism. 2. This project is doomed to fail. Capitalists invest in capital in order to save labor time. That is to say, the purpose of competition within capitalism is to eliminate workers. Over time, this drives up productivity while driving down labor force participation. Since all wealth is natural resources transformed by labor power, this isn't really a good thing, at least while so many live in poverty. Historically, the value of capital has gone up faster than productivity, leading to a falling rate of return over time. To stimulate the economy while avoiding traditional inflation, central banks all over the world have offered heaps of low-interest loans to financial institutions in a bid to artificially lower the interest rate, and it can't really get much lower. This allows for the creation of new demand while ensuring any new cash is tied to some kind of repayment scheme. This has largely resulted in bankers ruling the world as debt soars out of control. That fixed the money market problems. The labor market issues were addressed through union busting, flooding the electoral process with money, and especially imperial conquest. the rash of coups and assassinations in post-colonial Africa, the Contras in Latin America, funding terrorist organizations in Central Asia, the Korean and Indochina wars, the genocides in Indonesia, and even permanent normal trade relations with China. With investment decisions firmly back in the hands of capitalists, they returned to their historically weak investments, ensuring the economy would never heat up again. The unemployment rate is relatively low, but labor force participation in the First World is weak, and most jobs are horrible, largely owing to the proliferation of sweatshops in the global South, whom we robbed to the tune of trillions of dollars a year. Taxes were slashed, tariffs were abolished, and free trade was established to make it easier for capitalists to move capital at will without facing any democratic roadblocks. Quote, "In the last decades in the United States, the decoupling of profit and capital accumulation is evident. While overall after-tax corporate profit as a share of gross domestic product, GDP, has increased from about 4% in the mid-1980s to about 9% in the last few years, net investment as a share of GDP has declined from about 5 to 6% to about 2% during the same time. The disconnection between profit and investment has been particularly acute since the 2007 to 2009 economic crisis. Other advanced countries such as the United Kingdom and Japan have also seen similar patterns with downsizing, stock buybacks, and lack of interest in investment, or simply the capitalists' investment strike." End quote. Capitalists have shown an ability to invest much higher amounts of the surplus when unions and the socialist bloc were strong. What animates this level of investment isn't technology booms or some form of optimism, but class struggle. Unfortunately, even in the face of a crisis of legitimacy, our rulers have not meaningfully increased investment. It's perhaps the case that they can't. The problems have been changed, but they're still here. It goes without saying that this is not a sustainable model. The result: First world economies were effectively transformed by capitalists into global managers' offices. Products are designed and financed here, but outside the most cutting-edge stuff or the final assembly steps, they're not really built here. Much of the raw material is extracted from the third world, too. Finance and merchant capital are the dominant forms of capital, as the majority of actual production takes place in the third world under monarchs, dictators, military juntas, and fascist regimes installed, trained, or supported by NATO. The old forms of explicit apartheid, with the possible exception of nationalism, became unpalatable with the advent of the socialist bloc, black radicalism, and the successes of the suffragettes. But now that upward mobility is tied to financial assets, and no one living in ghettos or the third world has ever owned financial assets, there's no need to make it explicit anymore. Social mobility has deteriorated by 70% under Reaganomics. Tear down that wall and build a bank. Now that we can understand economics from the standpoint of actually studying economics, instead of filtering Mein Kampf through Google Translate over and over, we can proceed to examining Murray and Herrnstein's main arguments as they stack up against the history of nations who charted a path based on actual science over race science. Continued in Part 3.